My buddy Jeff lives in Longmont, Colorado. He's the guy who helps me with the podcast, and he made all the music. All the music's original for this program. He did all of that. Very, very, very talented man. He does the goofy little musical Easter eggs at the end as well. And we're just catching up, being pals. We've been friends for a long time, known each other since college, and we're driving through his hometown of Longmont, Colorado, and I saw a building. And I was like, oh, dang, was that an old Kmart? He's like, yeah, the Kmart was right there, right next to it. And then it's a little strip mall kind of thing. And I could just tell that it was a Kmart. And, not anymore because Kmart's defunct, but we're driving along. I'm like, that's weird. My kids would not be able to look at that and see the obvious hallmarks of Kmartdom. And then we went on to talk about the old Wendy's, that whenever they got repopulated with like a Mexican restaurant or something, you could still tell that was a Wendy's because, as Jeff observed, there was an atrium in the front. And anybody who was alive in the age of atrium-fronted Wendy's hamburger restaurants just knows what an old Wendy's looks like. You just know what an old Pizza Hut looks like. But that is knowledge that will gradually go downstream. And I wouldn't think to explain that to my kids because it's just common knowledge. If you were alive, you wouldn't even think to document it. But it's just one little tidbit of what made the world what the world was a few years ago that will gradually go away. And a long, long time from now, what would be absolutely common knowledge to every human in this country will be the kind of thing that if you want to gather that knowledge back and remember, like, what did Wendy's look like in the 1980s and 1990s? You're going to have to do a lot of work to put that back together. Same deal with crucifixion. People in the first century no doubt had a crystal clear picture of how this worked, of who it happened to, of what all the ground rules were. And though there are some sources today, some resources that speak of crucifixion as though we know exactly how everything was and what all the rules were, the reality is it isn't a super well-sourced practice, so we deal in generalizations. Some of the generalizations that my homework tells me are reliable are as follows. Crucifixion almost never at the time of Jesus was used on Roman citizens, but it looks like there are exceptions that we can observe in some of the later legal compendiums that come out over the centuries, and it looks like crucifixion used on citizens is something that happened still rarely, but a little more frequently as we move past the time of Jesus into the middle and late empire. Of course, the Jesus stuff we're looking at in Matthew, that's the very, very, very early era of the Roman Empire. It looks like we've got a decent amount of examples of people getting crucified for doing something that was perceived of as being a pushback against the government. It certainly looks like in the Gospels, Jesus is being crucified as an exaggerated mockery of his purported claims. Oh, you're the king of the Jews. Oh, you want to be lifted up. Okay, well, here, we'll lift you up real high. You want to be a king, kings with their outstretched arms to embrace and enfold their followers and their people. Well, we'll stretch your arms out for you. You can see what it looks like they were doing there, and we talked about that a bunch a few weeks back. But we also have hardcore examples of people who weren't insurrectionists getting crucified a little bit later on. Now, stick with me here. I think all of this really matters and is very interesting, but let's go back to our original example. Let's say 1,000 years from now, people are excavating a Wendy's old-fashioned hamburger restaurant, and they're digging around through one that was built during the lifetime of the great American president Barack Obama. And the excavators come out and they say, well, all the Wendy's that were built during the lifetime of the great American president Barack Obama, they all looked like this. And no doubt people 1,000 years from now would be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense because that was a long time ago and that's just how they did things back then. But you and I living right now would say, whoa, no, wait a minute, that's dynamic. In the 80s, during which time the great American president Barack Obama was alive, there was an atrium on those Wendy's, and they were made of like a dark red brick, and they had fake plants in the dining area. And they were designed to appeal to maybe just a little bit older crowd who wanted a hint of that sit-down experience. And they had signs that said, leave the cleanup to us, because they would come around and clear your trays whereas at other fast food restaurants, you would have to do it. But if you're talking about a Wendy's that was built in the 2010s, also squarely during the lifespan of the great American president Barack Obama, that'd be totally different, because more recent Wendy's use a lot of modern lines and simple block colors. They've got those giant Coca-Cola robots where you get to taste ever so subtly every single drop of flavor that anybody else has mixed into their horrid beverages over the last 4 or 5 times that a cup has been filled there. They've got touch screens that you can order on and lots of little cubby holes to sit in with a wide variety of seating and USB chargers at every single table. Gone are the days of the atrium. Here are the days of the very square building with lots of cubby holes to accommodate the 2010s or 2020s obsession with introvertism. Look, both of those Wendy's were made during the lifetime of great American President Barack Obama, and 1,000 years from now, very confidently speaking researcher is right in that they've unearthed 2 or 3 Wendy's that had the atrium design, but they're wrong in that they're making an overstatement. Look, it is really easy to make overstatements about Roman stuff and how they did things. And I think at times I have made overstatements about, this is how crucifixion works. This is how all of the capital punishment works. It's an easy mistake to make, but I got to remember, this is dynamic. There's a ton of time that falls on the timeline of what is Roman. You will also hear it said that women could not be crucified. I heard that for a really long time. I've repeated that before. But then I go and do a little bit of digging around, and it turns out that, we got some graffiti, like straight up graffiti from a building in the port city of Puteoli, a town that comes up just a little bit in the Bible. And in this tavern, there's graffiti of a woman. And this is kind of gross. You can plug your ears if you want. But she's crucified, and in the style of House Bolton, it looks like she's flayed as a part of her crucifixion. Well, maybe some dudes drew that and they felt scorned by that lady, and so in some dark, misogynistic, very violent fantasy, they drew this awful image. Or maybe it was reflective of an exception to the rule. Maybe sometimes women did get crucified. All of this is relevant to our conversation, not just because Jesus is being crucified and stuff means stuff, and we want to understand what that stuff, what crucifixion meant around 30 AD when this happened, because what it means speaks profoundly to the story. Who crucifixion was for speaks profoundly to how the original audience and how the original witnesses would have interpreted what was going on in front of their faces. But having a little broader understanding of how crucifixion worked, not in 200 AD, not in 400 AD, not even in 100 AD, but in the 30s AD, is also going to be really helpful for us to nail down a little bit more. Man, I did it again. That's a totally accidental pun. I'm sorry to everyone. That is not a kind of humor that is my first choice. Sometimes it just happens, and then you either go back and you edit it or you just roll with it. I'm going to roll with it. It's going to help us to nail down more details about the likely identity of these two guys Jesus was crucified in between. And at the most basic level, the question is, what were they guilty of? What did they do? Now, English translations will render the charges against them in different ways. I think the New Living Translation, I don't know, I don't have that in front of me. I think it says revolutionaries, whereas across most of the other translations that you'll read, NIV, ESV, King James, you'll get some version of thieves or brigands or robbers. And what you usually find when you see that there's a variety of words to describe the same thing, a variety of English words, that is, what you'll find when you go and you dig into the original Greek behind the English text is that there are more meanings to that singular Greek word than there are to the English word. And that can happen. Of course, language is not a code. It's not as simple as word A corresponds directly to word A in another language. Sometimes one word in one language can mean 6 different things in another. Probably the most famous example of this is you got all these different terms for love in Greek, but in English, I love pizza, I love my wife Camilla, I love my children, I love fly fishing, I love the Denver Broncos. There's a flattening of the meaning of that word. And this is why translation has an element of art to it, not just decoding. Well, then, in this case, we got a bona fide historical biblical riddle regarding who these thieves are. And we got 3 ways, I think, that we can reason our way to it. Manner of reasoning to figure out who these guys were, or what they did wrong. Number 1 is contextual social reasoning. What's going on here? What behavior would make sense on the part of the Romans, given their motivations? We'll think about that a little bit. Way number 2 is to look at the Greek word behind the English text. What are the different things that the Greek word here could be used? Are there other words used in other passages that might help us differentiate and get down to what these guys were guilty of? And the third way to try to get to the heart of the matter is just to look at what we know about the historical practice of crucifixion, and that might help us eliminate certain things that you just wouldn't get crucified for, or to focus more keenly on certain things that you likely would get crucified for around 30 AD. Why does all of this matter, you might ask? Why take all of this time and energy to try to figure out how we should best understand who these criminals were and what they did? Well, my biggest answer to that question would be because I want to, because I'm curious, because the text raises questions, and we have the luxury of being able to dig into those things, and I want to know. Some of you support this podcast at patreon.com/the TMBH That's ridiculously nice of you. Thank you a ton. Really, I mean, this whole thing exists because some of you do that. And I try to think of creative ways to tell you how much I appreciate it. And all of them seem to come up short to properly express how much I appreciate it. Thank you a ton for doing that. Those of you who do, or who have, or are considering doing so in the future. I appreciate all of you. Glad we get to do this together. More mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.